So our next presentation is Network Zone Analytics, what it is and how not to ruin it for everybody. And our presenter is Nikki DeMoville. She's the coordinator for electronic resources, acquisitions, and resource sharing at the Robert E. Kennedy Library in Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. She's also the chair of the Assessment and Analytics Functional Committee for the Cal State Library Consortia. And currently her interests are centered on evidence-based collection, assessment, and management. Outside of work, she enjoys cooking, crosswords, and her small herd of cats and dogs. And so with that, let's turn it over.
Hi, hello. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Let's see if we can get this going the way we want it to look. And you should be seeing just my slide. All right, excellent. So I'm going to preface this with the really bad news that there's a giant storm coming into our area, and my internet has been getting a little bit funky. So let's all just cross our fingers and hope that it lasts for half an hour. And so with that warning, I'll go ahead and start. Just a little bit about the California State University system. It's made up of 23 campuses, which vary in size from, on the big end, close to 40,000 students, and on the small end, we have a marine lab and a literal ship. So it's pretty varied. We migrated as a consortium. We had about a year to prep with a test bed and all sorts of other support because we were such a large and complicated system. And we went live in a wave over about a week and a half in June 2017. So that's been 18 months that we've been live in our consortial version, and I have to say we are still figuring things out, and ALMA is constantly changing and growing. We came up on the old interface and had just gotten all their training put together, and the new interface came out and everything changed. So that is pretty typical life with ALMA. And so as confusing as it is to come up in ALMA, when you come up in the network zone consortial environment, that has some even more confusing areas and areas of complete and total mystery. And one of the real black holes of mystery is the network zone analytics, which is why I chose to present on this for you. The thing is, when you get started with ALMA, you think you're just getting two systems. Yay, ALMA and some form of Primo. But actually what you're getting is you get your ALMA, you get your Primo, and then you actually get analytics as a separate bolted on module, which is Oracle Business Analytics Enterprise Edition. And then of course, each of those environments has an institutional version and a consortial version and sometimes a sandbox version. So, you know, if you feel like you are walking into a super confusing environment, you are not wrong. And then because analytics is an Oracle product rather than being developed by Ex Libris, the really fun part there is it's totally different from any of the rest of your Ex Libris products. It has its own learning curve, it has its own data mapping, and it has its own wonderful rules and quirks. Because this is such an area of mystery, I built this slide that actually shows what the whole environment looks like, because I feel like Ex Libris does not really do a good job of explaining this in any of their documentation. So you can see there the ALMA institution zone and the network zone, which people will usually just refer to as the IZ and the NZ, are where all the work in ALMA happens. The analytics is basically a data warehouse. It does not have a one-to-one relationship with the ALMA zones. It's always a day behind because the data is only published once per day at a specific time. So for us, that data starts to be published at 4 p.m., which is, as you can imagine, kind of inconvenient as far as like being able to capture a day's worth of data. And it actually takes about 4 hours to publish it, and things slow down a little bit during that time. So that whole data being published to analytics process is something you have to get used to. Your ALMA IZ is where everything local to your institution is managed. So that's all of your things like fulfillment activity, your user data, your acquisitions information, your physical holdings, your independently held electronic inventory, and most of your configurations live in your institution zone. Your Alma Network Zone contains your shared data. That's your shared catalog records, your shared e-resources and licenses, and your resource sharing network. That's basically the network zone is just for shared things. It doesn't have any holdings or inventory of its own. And then every evening, that publication process happens to analytics. The IZ data is actually published to two places. It goes to your own IZ analytics area, and then it's also published to the NZ analytics. And so that's the really important takeaway, and the one area where you will hear the most questions and the most misinformation. But NZ analytics contains all the institution zone data from all of your institutions in your whole network, plus all of your network zone data. It's not just data from your NZ. So this is the first of some slides I have that are going to be kind of text heavy because I figure these are going to be available later, so don't try to take frantic notes. We'll just share the slides. The gist of this one is that you need a network zone account to run reports in NZ Analytics. But fear not, the roles actually have practically no power to do anything except run reports. So I always advocate for giving them out to anyone who needs them. What we've found is that the reports are often very localized, they're very ad hoc, and so it just makes more sense to let the users design or run their own reports. So as an example, I spent the last couple of months working on the ACRL reports for our consortium, which is to say I was developing a toolkit that everyone could use. And the more I worked on the project, the more I realized just how hard it is to account for every tiny inconsistency from one environment to the next. And I just found that in the end, no matter how nice your dashboards and prompted reports are, some local users will probably still need to customize them. And then there's just one other fun little quirk with Network Zone Analytics, and that is that even though you have a separate account for IZ Analytics and NZ Analytics, you cannot run them at the same time, even in separate browsers. There's some kind of weird invisible link, and if you try it, it's pretty much guaranteed that one or both of your screens will freeze and just die on you. So basically, you have to export results if you want to compare side by side or do a screenshot. So fun stuff. So what can you do in NZ Analytics? So first of all, NZ Analytics is just a bigger version of IZ Analytics. It just has more data. So you still have a My Folders area, and you still have access to all of the Alma out-of-the-box reports and community reports. The major difference is that you have access to all of your consortial data, plus the network folder for shared reports that only members of your consortium can see or use. One drawback is that the My Folders area in NZ Analytics is only linked to your NZ account. So that means that if you save a report that you created in IZ Analytics to your My Folders in IZ Analytics, you cannot get to it from NZ Analytics. Despite that weird linking I mentioned, Analytics still sees your IZ and NZ accounts as completely separate users for that My Folders area. So that is kind of annoying that you can't share with yourself in your own private folder. The simplest workaround is to use a community folder. These are equally accessible from IZ and NZ Analytics. So you have to put it where everyone can see it, but you can move stuff back and forth. So one of the things we do in our consortium is build toolkits of reports for people to use. So we'll put those in a single folder and then have subfolders labeled run in the IZ and run in the NZ. So then users can copy the entire toolkit into their My Folder area in both the IZ and the NZ, and then just run the appropriate reports from the appropriate login. An NZ report will not break if you run it in your IZ, it just won't give you the right data or the data you were expecting. So at this point, you're probably asking, hey, if all the data is in NZ Analytics, why not just run all your reports there? And there's two really important reasons why you never ever use NZ Analytics unless you're really forced to. And the first reason is that you want to use your own analytics, your IZ analytics, because having the other institution's data available, if you don't need it, means that you just have to constantly filter it out, and that complicates the logic of your reports. The second more important reason is really unfortunate, and that's speed. The amount of data produced by a consortium is enormous, and it's constantly growing. And as it's currently implemented, unfortunately, analytics cannot really handle it. And we've been working with Ex Libris and trying to figure out what the problem is, but there are just terrible issues at the consortial scale. Analytics also is currently set up to automatically log users out at 59 minutes and 59 seconds, regardless of whether they are currently active in their session. So this is enough of a problem in IZ Analytics where you're suddenly dumped out, but with NZ Analytics, the reports often take so long to run that they actually can't finish in that hour-long time frame. Ex Libris has been hinting that there's some improvements to the timeout issue coming, but they haven't given us any details. And the other thing that will happen in NC Analytics is sometimes the report just stops with an error message, and it will be a very mysterious Oracle error message like error 3563HX2. But if you go and look at it, it'll always basically comes down to your report was too big and I choked on it. So a lot of times that means that you end up going looking for a different report strategy, or you have to use advanced features like the aggregation rules to try to optimize your reports, or sometimes it means that you have to run multiple reports on smaller sets. So obviously, if the report is one that you can run in your IZ instead, you'll be running a less complicated report on smaller data set, and you can maybe avoid some of those file size errors. As a general tip for working with Alma Analytics, no matter what kind of report you're building, just get into the habit of constantly saving. About every 1 minute, just hit the save button, because even the smallest diversion, a telephone call, someone stopping by your desk, can cause you to get timed out and lose all of your hard work. So unfortunately, despite its real usefulness, I'm just going to say NC Analytics is probably the most frustrating environment you'll deal with as a consortium. It's going to make regular Alma look like just the most wonderful thing. So one of the things that I'm hoping actually is that as more consortia come on board, there's going to be more pressure and incentive to help get Ex Libris to improve this area. So I did put together this chart to just help you know where you actually must use NC Analytics and also where you don't need to. So where you see those X's, that's where you have to go to the network zone. And the common denominator is that these reports all require data that isn't available in IZ Analytics. So now that you've seen where you have to use NC Analytics, you can see how certain areas would be the heaviest users. If you share your e-resources in the network zone, you'll be using NC Analytics to report on e-inventory. If you have a resource sharing network set up, then those reports naturally need to be run in NC Analytics as well. And finally, some collection analysis reports must be run in the NZ because they need to include consortial resources or holdings information from other institutions. So this is an example of a typical electronic inventory report. And if you've been an innovative user and you're used to doing create lists, you're probably looking at this and going, oh man. So yes, it's a very different environment. But if you have consortially managed e-resources and you need to answer those ACRL and IPEDS surveys, you're going to be running reports like this. So I want to point out the two columns on the right, the one that says institution name at the top and the one that says available for group members. That group member information is how you add your shared e-resources to the report. This is especially important if your consortium is using the NZ to manage opt-in deals so that each institution has a unique list of subscribed resources. The green squares in the institution column, you can see they say Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Those indicate the resources that we've licensed on our own. The red squares in that string of codes are my institution's group code, and you can see how it appears in that string, and that sometimes that string has many campuses and sometimes it only has a few. And basically you get the full picture of your e-resources by creating filters in analytics with OR logic that include both of them. And just on a side note, you can just use the filters and not have the columns showing. I did it partly just for example, and also because partly when you're building a report, it's nice to double check that all your resources are really in there, and then you can take the columns out later. I have a reference slide at the end of the slides that I'll be sharing that actually just gives you the exact logic to make this report, because it's pretty standard, but it's a little hard to figure it out initially. Some of this consortial information is also available in IZ Analytics, but it's really frustrating because it's missing most of the bibliographic fields that you would need for, important filters like books versus journals. Go figure. Moving on to consortial resource sharing, if you're doing that, you can use NZ Analytics to look at the whole picture of borrowing and lending across the system. So this slide has a couple of tabs from our resource sharing dashboard that lives in our NZ Analytics. One of the things we can track is how long it takes for materials to move through the system, which is, it's kind of nice. I mean, it gives you an idea of your efficiency, but it also gives you an idea of the impact. So we can tell by looking at this that on average, if a book leaves our library, goes to another library, and then comes back, it's going to be gone for about 44 days. So you can see we've got average time that materials spend in transit, time they spend on the hold shelves, time they spend checked out to the patron. And then another thing we look at is the sheer volume of borrowing and lending across the system. That back image shows cumulative totals for each institution. And it's really interesting to see how the different institutions compare. Of course, it's important to use additional context when you're looking at this and ask the right questions. For example, a campus with high borrowing numbers might need to add some collections to their library. On the other hand, they may just be really good at marketing and have made the resource sharing links more widely available. So getting at those questions is the really interesting part. After you've been live for a while, you'll want to start asking. So speaking of that context, what you might want to be asking, if you want to report on resource sharing activity for just your own institution, you can do some of that in the IZ, but you'll probably still end up going to the NZ. And that's because borrowing requests in your IZ don't retain very much bibliographic or holdings data because they're done like on the fly records. So it's just very brief record and it doesn't really hang around. But they do have all of your fulfillment data. Lending requests, on the other hand, contain all the data from the lending library, which includes the full bibliographic record. So basically, if you're looking for information on who is using your resource sharing system, then you can run that report locally on borrowing requests. So that's the report on the left. That's run on borrowing data in our local system, and you can see how the fulfillment data is appearing. So we can see, for example, that undergraduates in a variety of majors are borrowing that particular book, and it's probably a textbook. On the other hand, you can see that important bibliographic data and holdings data is just not there. So if you want to know what subjects or call number areas your institution is needing the most, you actually have to go to NZ Analytics and run a lending report, because that will show you what items other campuses have sent to you. So you can see that data in the second example. Now there's subjects and call number information, but unfortunately there's no fulfillment data. And the biggest unfortunate thing is borrowing and lending are different subject areas in analytics, and there's no good way to actually combine this data into just one report. I don't think we haven't tried. That brings us to collection analysis, where you might use NZ Analytics in a couple of different ways. One major way is if you want the whole picture of what e-resources you have in a given discipline, you do need to run it in the NZ Analytics in order to include your shared collections. The report on the left is one that I did as part of our campus's music department accreditation. It contains all of our local and consortial e-resources related to music, broken out in a way that mimics the reports on print resources. The other report is a sample showing how NZ Analytics can be used to show what campuses own specific titles. This can be useful for weeding or collection development initiatives where you might want to do something cooperative with other campuses in your system. And you can see in the top line, that archaeological chemistry book, it has 0 other institutions. So that would be an example of a unique title for our campus. And then you can see that the next one is owned by a total of 7 other institutions, and they're listed there. So that can be really interesting and useful. So that's what NZ Analytics is all about and why you would use it. Now to the important part about how to make sure it's clean and useful. And I have boiled this down to 3 major tips so you don't ruin it for everyone. So the first tip is your P2E. A couple of people have already mentioned this, and in fact, it is the most dreaded part possibly for your e-resources people. It's way more confusing than it needs to be, and somehow none of the documentation is as useful as you would like. You feel like you read through it and it's full of information, and somehow it's still, none of it quite helps you. So I think the most important thing when you're creating your P2E file is not to confuse individual titles with the packages they are part of and mismapping them as the wrong kind of resource. Because using the wrong resource type will not only create a nightmare cleanup issue for you post-migration, it also creates permanent headaches in your NZ Analytics. So the absolutely most important, if you remember nothing else for your P2E, is that if it's an individual title, you can catalog it separately. It's a single ebook, it's the journal of whatever. It's a portfolio, whether it's in a package or not. It's just a portfolio. And so a bonus tip is that if you know you're going to be sharing an e-resource in your network zone, just exclude those records from your whole migration. Just don't even send them. Start clean. So one of the reasons for that is, I'll mention an example here, is that our consortium did an early attempted overlap analysis for ebook collections because we were thinking of ordering something consortially and we wanted to know how many campuses had already licensed those titles. And so we immediately ran into a problem where we found that a couple of institutions had migrated their individual ebook records for eBook Central Academic Complete as standalone portfolios. So if you know anything about that collection, you know it has over 100,000 titles, and that titles roll in and out of the package. So we were suddenly faced with 100,000 titles that had all kinds of duplicates throughout the system that weren't tagged with a collection, and some of them were no longer available. So it just made a mess of our spreadsheets. So it has been cleaned up, but you know, in hindsight, it would be best to just advise everybody not to send those records. And here is the most unfortunate example of a P2E accident. On the left, you can see the filter window for what eCollections looks like in my institution's IZ Analytics zone. You can see it has about 300 choices in a nice readable menu that loads quickly. On the right is our consortium's IZ Analytics filter for eCollections. It's permanently contaminated by around 14,000 e-resource titles that were labeled as packages instead of as portfolios in the P2E file. They've been fixed by the campus that did it, but they will be stuck in analytics forever. On a side note, while I won't say which campus caused this problem, everything in analytics is tagged in some way with your institution data. So if you create a mess, everybody will know it was you. So if that doesn't keep you honest, then I can't help you. The great thing about analytics is it has a record of every single thing that ever happened in ALMA. You will never again need to create hidden withdrawn locations or other workarounds for the sake of history or statistics. And that is really awesome. But unfortunately, it means that there's a permanent record of everything that ever happened, including some things that you wish nobody knew about or that you could forget. Consistent codes and names are the other major thing to think about. Somehow, the CSU ended up with really inconsistent institution names and resource sharing partner names that didn't match our institution names. So you can see, for example, that our Bakersfield institution is CSU Bakersfield in one place and just Bakersfield in another place. So that meant that our first attempts at resource sharing reports had nonsensical tables. You can see in the example on the upper left there how the entries don't match up nicely because the non-matching names don't sort the same way alphabetically. And if there's one thing analytics loves to do, it's sort things alphabetically. So I ended up having to create that case statement you see at the bottom so that all the entries were changed to matching names. We have to use that every single time we want matching entries, so that you get basically that report on the upper right where you can see that everything matches, sorts in the same order, and matches neatly in the report. So if you can, I recommend starting out with consistent names for your institutions across the board in every module in ALMA. And on a side note, we had a similar problem with our group member names for electronic resources. A couple of our campuses ended up with shorter names that consisted of letter strings that were also part of slightly longer campus names. So for example, Chico is CSUC, but Channel Islands is CSUCI. That meant that those campuses could not use their group member names to produce a unique list of their resources. The entire problem could have been avoided if we'd realized in advance that group members needed to have completely unique names, preferably with the same number of letters. The other thing to consider in migration is where to map your data. CSU was coming from a number of different ILS systems. I think we came from Voyager, Millennium, Sierra, and COA, possibly a couple of others. So we had no idea how anything would work in analytics, and we didn't end up specifying a consistent mapping template. And that's fine, because you're just dealing with a lot of campuses and a lot of systems. But it meant that item notes in particular ended up being this kind of Wild West situation where some campuses mapped something to note 1, some campuses mapped it to note 2, some campuses mapped it to note 3. And so later on, if you have policies and practices that you want to specify, like how to specify your withdrawn items for an audit report, you have to do it as kind of a loose directive. You can't say, put it in statistics note 3. You have to say, put it in a statistics note. And that just means that if later on you want to have someone in your consortium creating reports for everyone to share, that they have to put in these complicated or statements like you see in that upper right hand filter screenshot. So before I finish up, a quick word about playing nicely in the shared environment. Consistent naming and good labeling are always a good practice. I'm sure everyone knows that. But where you can really get into trouble is in the community areas, because Oracle Business Analytics wants to make it super easy for everybody to share and use work. But unfortunately, it also makes it really easy for people to accidentally mess with someone else's shared reports. So I just cannot overemphasize the really, really important thing, which is that if you want to use a report from the community zone, copy and paste it to my folders before you do anything else. And also never, ever, ever, ever click and drag a report or folder, because it will remove it from the original place. And analytics will totally let you do this. It will not warn you. It will just happen. And I have a personal example for that one, because I was in my analytics area yesterday and I noticed that our entire folder of shared ACRL reports had been dragged out of our community folder and off to parts unknown. So no idea where it went. It could have been literally anyone in the ALMA community. So fortunately, we have a backup copy and we could restore it. And that is my final tip. For any report that you share anywhere in the community zone, keep a clean backup of it somewhere safe. But other than that, really, I can't say enough good things about the analytics community. Just make use of it, contribute your own reports to it, and just make it better and better for everyone. This is the first reference slide that I have. Don't try to take notes. I'll share the slides, but excuse me, when you're working in NZ Analytics, a lot of the filter menus just take a very, very long time to populate. So you can save a lot of time if you know what to type in advance. ALMA is strangely inconsistent in some of its places, It's not always easy to remember whether you need to say in repository, active, or available, so I made this chart to help. Also, some of the field mappings aren't quite the same as all the fields they're based on, so this explains some of those. And this is the second reference slide with the logic you can use to build the most essential filters for working in NC Analytics. I've got a slide here with a few links for further resources to help you get started. And that's it. Thanks for listening.
Okay. Thank you, Nikki. We are just about at time, so there won't be that much time for questions. The main question that came in, and again, if you have any questions for her and I don't get to answer them, please feel free to email her. Rebecca wanted to know if you could lock the folder so that people have to request to use it, or if it's shared, it's shared.
Well, I have kind of heard anecdotally that there are ways of controlling access to the folders, and I know Ex Libris does it with their out-of-the-box reports, but it requires having pretty good knowledge of how to use Oracle Analytics. And then the other thing is that, so if people are requesting to use your stuff, it sort of undermines the whole idea of freely usable community objects.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we are now at time, so we're not going to be able to answer any other questions for Nikki right now. So if you have any questions for Nikki, please email her, and we're going to move on to our next presenter. But thank you, Nikki.
All right.
That's great. Thank you.
All right.